I'm Mark Seeley, Director of Autograph, which is an organisation, I suppose, that's been around now since about 1988, but kind of more of that later. I'm just going to really talk tonight about the kind of, I suppose, the genealogy of why it is that a project like this kind of comes under the prism of the work that we've been doing with Autograph. And I think one of the things that I've become aware of over, say, the last, say, 10 years is the kind of growth towards, I suppose, things like celebrity within the visual arts. And the whole idea that, I suppose, the over-excessive corporatization of our industry in many ways. And that's not just through the individuals and the amounts of money that have come into the sector or come into the art world. It's also to do with the kind of pressure that's on arts organisations and what they're supposed to deliver and what success is supposed to be and how we measure that. And I think some of the things that I find, when we can discuss these afterwards as well if you want, some of the things I find most disturbing are the kind of, I suppose, the pseudo kind of policies that are in place, which talk about things like engagement and reaching out to disenfranchised people and communities, and how things like identity politics and gender and race and class and difference play into that kind of field. And watching these issues come in and out of vogue at a kind of public level, at a funding level, and how it is that projects are seen as, I suppose, either trendy or not trendy, or seen as something to get involved in or not get involved in. And questions of sustainability around what, we should lock them out actually. How's that for engagement? You can watch from outside. And how the kind of idea of the kind of quick fix, I suppose, to ideas is both, as I say, both at a public level in terms of funding, and also in many of the artists that I've worked with or tried to talk to or have approached us as an organisation for things that they want to do. Basically just how superficial many projects are and how superficial the kind of funding sector could be, and whether these, whether difference is even possible if things keep on, or if the terrain keeps on changing that much. Question is, where does one stand if one does want to make a kind of difference? Where does one stand if one wants to kind of socially engage with something, and how long and how much time have you got to deliver that? And I think when I became aware of what, Julian and Patricia and Marilla were doing, it was, I suppose, I hate using the term, but I suppose it was self-evident that something was going on that was more than just a 6-day assignment, working in some, I suppose, hostel or mission or some engaged space or some refugee camp, and imagining that there was a set of kind of definitive photographs that would come out of that would 9 times out of 10 either end up as a World Press Prize in some portfolio or an exhibition or a book, or funded by some NGO and used in some kind of campaign. What I was really interested in was the whole idea of how they were trying to work with the kids and not simply just document the kids. Now, there's a long tradition of, I suppose, facilitators and people using cameras to try and get the kids or get younger people or disenfranchised communities to speak through the lens. But as I said, they're often through kind of weekends or workshops or just a few days. And the longevity of this, the time that was involved in it, I think was something that marked it apart. Now, I wasn't really sure whether how that marking apart would kind of manifest itself, apart from the fact that I think the only thing that it could possibly become was an archive. I don't think after so much time involved in it, it couldn't be anything else. The question then became, where would that archive live and how would it manifest itself? And what would we here, one of the key questions I was always concerned with is what relevance does it have to kind of our lives here? And what would we be replicating by engaging with it? And what are the kind of social problems that we would be imagining as we read into these lives. So the question of relevance, I still think, is one that's kind of open. How do we work with it? And then the other question is, fundamentally, what, I suppose, what is the work that the images are going to do on us? What does it mean in that sense? So I just wanted to start, that's just kind of introduction to my thinking about why I was interested in it. Why was it so engaging? I just wanted to start with a little clip just to kind of frame some of the kind of political concerns that brought me into the prism of thinking about this whole idea of inclusion and exclusion. So I'll just play you about 4 or 5 minutes of, I suppose, someone I've been lucky enough to work with for about 15, 16 years. It's Professor Stewart Hall, namely. So I'll just play this for you.
To enliven a cold evening. We are here to stay. We are in the center of the creative and cultural life of the society, and we require the jobs, the training, the opportunities, the funding. We want the path open, especially for the young people of this society, the young black people of this society, who have created in their myriad art forms, from writing, poetry, dance, music, right through to rap, created a new culture, a culture which in its variety and power astonishes now the eyes of young white people in the society, which is a mark, a sign that they are the people of the future. And that needs organization and funding. And we have to go out and get it because it's ours.
There you go. So if I just clear that off and then open up a PDF. So round about 1986, as you can see, people like Stewart Hall are clearly arguing for kind of, societal change around access and funding and power and privilege. And when I was kind of reviewing some of the things that Stewart said for a project we just finished up in Liverpool, this project kind of came to mind around how it is and what kind of power structures are in place. And these questions of the exotic and how we position these types of works within our understanding of where they are. I'll just try and open this file a second and move things on a little bit. Okay. And I think we just go here. We good? Yeah. So there'll be a random set of slides that I put through. Some of them are fairly graphic in their imagery. And then I was thinking, really, but there is, of course, this fundamental relationship that kind of photography has to understanding kind of difference or cultural difference in that moment. That in many ways, the kind of history of photography and the Enlightenment period, if you like, are intrinsically wrapped up, those ideas about how we see other people, how we, you know, if we look at the politics of what was happening, you know, and in terms of the visualization. What do I do? Oh, I have to do it here. That's it. If we look at the kind of visualization, if you like, of the black subject in frame, or the, you know, I suppose, the other, of how it enters into our vision, what we expect we see. There's a long kind of trajectory of violent images, you know, of people from different spaces within our kind of culture, if you like, within our art history, within how we understand what happens in different spaces. And this is something I've been looking at for quite a while, how we've come to understand the visualization of race, what that actually means, and all those kind of assumptions we have about, I suppose, cultural difference, and where they sit both within popular culture and within kind of high art, if you like. And what artists were trying to do in terms of, you know, this representational field, what people were trying to say about the conditions that were at play, especially when, you know, difference is literally played out, and the extreme levels and conditions that people are involved in. And one of the things that I was, you know, trying to get out of the interview I did with Julian and Patricia, I'm not sure how successful it was for them to maybe kind of consider their position of privilege within this process. And I think it's a question that if, I don't know whether any of you have read the essay in PhotoWorks magazine, but I laugh when I read it back, because there's an obvious slippery moment, or two or three, within the kind of conversation. They keep on bringing it back. They keep on trying to bring the question, or they keep on trying to avoid the question, or they won't answer the question about the question of their power within this process and what they're actually getting out of that. I wanted to try and have a conversation about what that actually means for them. I mean, we can recognize, if you like, the altruistic kind of nature of what it is they're trying to do, but I think the question of power and display, I mean, and where they sit within that is really, I think, still open within this process. You know, and then if we're going to talk about how, you know, power works, and if we're going to look at the representational field and where, you know, this art form sits within it, one's got to think about it in terms of, you know, how histories unfold on this. So one of the key things I've been, you know, aware of is that if we think about the history of photography, it feels like it's something quite short in many ways. It feels like it's very close to us. And if we think about the history of slavery, or you know, colonialism, or these violent regimes, it feels as though somehow it's something that's a million miles away now. No one really wants to talk about it. But they're actually very closely aligned. You know, as you know, the invention of photography and the abolition of slavery are very, very close together in terms of where they sit in a timeline. And it's not surprising then that if we think about what the application of photography was used for, it mirrors in many ways the ideologies that are at play at that time. It absolutely critically is, applied to the theoretical understandings of how enlightened thinkers were positioning people in the world. And I think in many ways that's also something that we could, you know, unmap or fold into our understanding of what, you know, Julian and Patricia and Muriel were trying to do. It's like they're trying to create, if you like, or trying to reflect their view in many ways on what these people are actually experiencing. Although the mediation is slightly different. I sometimes wonder whether the mediation is really inclusive, or whether there is still this kind of observational kind of power play that allows the editing process, or what's selected to come forward, somehow excludes the subject. You know, I mean, I suppose one of the fault lines is that it would, in terms of a project like this, it might have been more interesting to think about, you know, if the kids were actually here in that sense, if there was a dialogue around the way that this was displayed, not mediated through an editorial process, but just to kind of consider their presence in the space would change the very dynamic of what was happening in the space if they were here, let's just say, on a regular basis, facilitating the show, for example. It would change the process, because all of a sudden the distance between them and us would be closed. And I think I'm interested in those spaces, how far we are apart. And I think we're still very far apart in those moments. And there's always been this sense of, and I'm not sure, the groundwork that's been done in theory and in history and across the visual arts, I'm not sure whether we've unpicked, I could argue, the damage that's been done historically when we talk about race. Even the very term seems to be implicitly loaded if we just look around what's just been happening across the Premier League at the moment. I mean, there's this kind of an intrinsic tension around difference, which simply won't go away. How we resolve it, even at a kind of, in the year 2012, is still very open. What do we actually do about that? And I think there was a desire in the around 2005, to enter into a kind of post-race space, especially as we talked about the visual arts. There was a distinctive moment about 6 or 7 years ago, and mainly people like Thelma Golden and Glenn Ligon were trying to kind of eradicate the question of race through production, if you like, through production of their work, i.e. arguing the very case that, artists have the right to be in a kind of post-race space and we shouldn't be looking at their production through the prism of who they are. Well, that's a very privileged space, I would argue, and I'm not sure how one actually gets to that moment, because I don't think we can simply eradicate it by simply looking at the production process. So this idea of, bringing or trying to develop a kind of humanitarian engagement with otherness is a long-standing process, and it's a long-standing kind of visual game, if you like, that's been going on. In Du Bois's archive, 1900, I don't know if people are familiar with this. I mean, we showed some of the archive in our space at Rivington Place in London a couple of years ago. But it's a fantastic project, because what he's actually trying to do for the first time is to present the African-American Negro as a kind of human subject, right? So as early as, 1900, people like Du Bois are trying to prove the humanity of people from different spaces by simply presenting them, if you like, or simply presenting the human face of what their experiences are. So I would tie what, Julian, Jermaine, and Patricia Murillo have been doing to this kind of space, to this idea that you can maybe try and, present this face of otherness so that you can, in a way, identify with that by closing that, I suppose, that distance away from this subject. And I think there's a fundamental and genuine attempt in this project to deliver that. So I think that's kind of like to be lauded in many ways. But at the same time, it's problematic because of what's in the frame. It is deeply problematic. The fault line in Du Bois's work here, I've argued, is that throughout the presentation he did in Paris, he forgot to actually name the subject and the sitter. So that in many ways, he replicated the objectification of the subject in the frame. They simply became just another presentation of the Negro subject. So I think the naming of the subject in the frame would have been very radical in that moment. But maybe the time and the space and what the work was doing around 1900 didn't actually warrant that. It was maybe sufficient enough to show that there was a healthy, middle-class, well-educated African-American subject that sat in the frame and could replicate, if you like, the tradition, or be framed within that kind of traditional and classic kind of structure of that framing. Because, I mean, typically outside of what Du Bois was trying to do, was to counteract this space, the idea of continuous servitude, okay? i.e., that the black subject was always in the frame simply to render something else more important. This long tradition of, especially within early photography, if you look at when the black subject enters the frame, they are perpetually in this space of simply adding, if you like, a kind of visual code to greater authority in that moment. So when I look at these kind of packages that what people like, Patricia and Julian Murillo are trying to do, what they're trying to offer, is these insights into these kind of worlds. I'm kind of locating it within this kind of historical trajectory of where race sits within our space. Because the things that draw me into this project are not necessarily the fact that they're kind of homeless kids. It's the kind of space and the, I suppose, the type of kind of kids they are. You know, for me, one of the key markers in this project is their race, is where they're located within that kind of utopian idea of a kind of Brazilian society which has been, projected out there. I think one of the underlying things we never discussed in the interview, and I don't think people were that comfortable with that, was the question of race in this space within this project. And I think Brazil as a society is still trying to reconcile how it deals with its contemporary and often fantasy image of how race is played out within that space. So, for example, in a city like Sao Paulo, you'll find, or even Belo Horizonte, you'll find that the majority of the people in positions of power, like here, are not reflected or come from or are identified from the types of people that are in these photographs. I mean, most of the museums and cultural industries in Brazil are run by people from European extracts. So the whole Afro presence in there is, of course, through music and through football and through sport, kind of echoes many of the things that have happened across Europe anyway. So it's a very similar story about how race and power plays out. And I put images like this in because it's really important to kind of understand how kind of, this moment never happened. This kind of, Queen Victoria giving this kind of noble savage the gift of civilization, if you like, through this Bible. But it's a kind of fantasy projection that sits within the National Portrait Gallery or Tate Britain or somewhere. I think actually it is the National Portrait Gallery. But you have to dig quite deep in terms of the knowledge of this painting to understand that it's a total construction. It never happened. And yet when these images are on the wall, they represent a real authoritative kind of moment. So there's a kind of, the fantasy of otherness, really. So, where the reality of 1863 or the 1860s was very much this space, very much around, the Navy, if you like, taking up its role as policemen of the high seas. And the reality of the African subject was that, capture and forced enslavement were very much, the package. The idea that that these kids, as kind of human cargo, rather was the real encounter or the actual encounter, rather than this imagined encounter. Okay. And I think this is where photography, begins to play a very kind of important role for us, especially as we look at. I find this photograph particularly disturbing simply because of just how young those people are. Even when we think about like the image of something like slavery or human cargo, somehow you never really equate it to this kind of degree of vulnerability. So I would argue on another day that photography has been implicitly violent as an act when otherness is put into the frame. I think I would argue that those of us, or those that picked up the camera, and to some degree those that still do pick up the camera, either consciously or unconsciously, are very much falling in line with a long trajectory of kind of cultural violence against the other. And I think it's very difficult to break away from that space because of the legacy, if you like, of what and how difference enters the frame. And there's always this kind of, I think there are degrees of sensitivity around that, and things are kind of changing. But there is this sense of kind of privilege when one is behind the camera. Especially, I think there is a kind of cultural assumption of authority in place when, when I suppose, let's name it, when I think Julian and Patricia Murillo are in this space, there is a clear question of authority. But then there's always the kind of contradiction about what do you actually do with, if you want to, advocate if you want to make or bring in the question of change, how do you do that? And I think there's these photographs by Alice Seeley Harris from the Congo around about 1905. It's another project I've been working on for quite a while, but there's this kind of evidential part, obviously, around how, violence has been played out throughout that whole kind of like colonial regime. I mean, Leopold's regime is implicitly violent. Alice Seeley Harris, she becomes probably the first person to take a series of photographs and go into a huge campaign across Europe and North America to expose the degrees of, I suppose, violence that, Leopold's Congo represents, 1905. It's interesting, though, as well, that these pictures are mainly through the prism of the anti-slavery movement and not necessarily through the prism of photography. So it's interesting that Alice Seeley Harris, a major kind of missionary with the camera, gets left out of that story in terms of understanding the importance of photography and its humanitarian act. I think most people tend to start with, Louis Hine and various other men who have been very active in bringing, impoverishment and working class conditions into the frame. But Alice never becomes part of that story. And it's interesting, a kind of self-portrait. And it's interesting, for me, it plays out the kind of, the contradictions of how power works. On the one hand, she's trying to bring into the frame, the kind of conditions of these men and women. And on the other hand, she builds herself as a self-authoritative figure on the pile of these kind of African children. It's a kind of contradiction in that for me, which basically clearly identifies kind of how she sees herself in that role, how she positions herself as this kind of grand woman on top of this structure. And those kind of, and I think even within those kind of great benevolent moments, we don't have to look too hard and far to find, if you like, the fault lines of, representing and working with, disenfranchised people. And the genealogy of that, it goes all the way through the, the history of photography in particular. It's because that history, I suppose, is loaded with authoritative figures, who set the stall out and say this is the way it is, who have done their field work, who've studied, who have charted, captured, logged, killed, and represented, and built their books and displayed their knowledge for us. And it becomes a kind of knowledge that is kind of uncontestable in that moment. It becomes uncontestable because in many ways, we're receptive to that, because to ask questions about how authority, particularly generated by European men, is brought to us. It's often empirical, it's often simply, a field study, and they're interpreted through the very fact that they were there. And presented as classic bound volumes that tell us what we're supposed to be seeing. And I think, for me, this is kind of, I know it's a rather extreme version of how knowledge is generated, but it's kind of like that still. It's about power and access. And I enjoy the fact that power and access in this space has got this kind of underlying kind of military presence. It's an authority that comes with the capacity to destroy. Okay? So you don't question it. You don't question how it is that these by the very fact that they were there and the observations that they've made, they become the bedrock, if you like, of our kind of cultural attitudes towards spaces like Africa. And even Africa itself, the very word Africa has become a kind of, a tainted space. The way that it's used kind of curatorially, as if somehow it just becomes another kind of, I suppose Africa becomes like a doing word. Let's do kind of Africa. It becomes a verb rather than a kind of continent. It becomes kind of synonymous with, thousands of different kind of cultural or people's different kind of cultural backgrounds. It gets ironed over. And we still surround it, even in terms of a curatorial package today, with a disproportionate degree of kind of red, yellow, and green, and, I suppose, drumming in cafes, and, popular figures like Fela Kuti, and it becomes a kind of, bit of a kind of fantasy figure, really. Even and this whole idea of the projection of Africa in Europe becomes a long-standing part of kind of cultural erasure. These are the Herero who were literally wiped out by the German military in something like 1907 because they dared to resist German occupation. I mean, these people were kind of, I suppose, the kind of precursor to what happened in 1920s, 30s, 40s Germany in relation to the Jews. All the homework was done prior to the Holocaust in Africa. And I think we need to join those dots, you see, in terms of kind of cultural spaces. We need to kind of, not necessarily dislocate those moments as if they somehow occur as a kind of blip in society, as a blip in spaces. They're not blips. They're fundamental, long-term, historical legacies that bring us to a place where we can watch or value or literally kill or annihilate kind of other people's kind of cultural conditions. And it's not necessarily, I suppose, through, genocidal acts or Holocaustal acts. It's also through, I suppose, the kind of terms and conditions of which people have to survive within. And I would say that that's fundamentally played out. It's not about numbers. It's not about 6 million people. It's because these kids, when they don't survive the conditions of, let's just say, a modern metropolis, they don't survive the conditions of a modern metropolis. They become a kind of, number in a graveyard. But there are certain social conditions around these people that mean that they simply will never survive. There have been no avenues out of those spaces. So you have to ask yourselves within a kind of given society, what is going on that allows that to happen, and where does responsibility live in that place? So if it's structurally and socially engineered, then someone somewhere is managing a pretty, nihilistic space where these kids have to survive within. How do we challenge that? How do we change that? I would argue that, just to bring kind of this in relation to what Julian has done, I think there is a desire to do that. There is a desire to bring that out. But the question is, what acts follow that? And if the social conditions are that we can watch people die, that we can celebrate the fact or not care about where they are, then in many ways you may as well lynch them. Because the end game is that, as a society, you simply watch this happen. This is like, 1920s, America. We may as well simply put these kids out to dry, because there are no social structures to stop this happening, in theory, okay? You may as well, the most disturbing aspect of these photographs for me, this is from the project Without Sanctuary, are not the people being lynched. It's the pleasure of the lynching moment, especially in the eyes of young children. Okay? It's the theater of enjoyment and the spectacle of that space. And if the spectacle of that space means that, we can walk by kids in the street and simply, step over them, then you may as well, as I say, lynch them. You may as well leave it in that space. And the question then is, where does responsibility live? How do we name those spaces? Okay? And it's always been in that space. I was never really, seduced by the whole idea of Abu Ghraib and the photographs that came out from effectively the concentration camps there. There's always been this relationship towards power and display of authority. The whole idea that, people this is Algeria in 1960, and this is a Muslim woman who's been stripped and presented to the camera for colleagues to share and enjoy. So there's always been this massive capacity for debasement within our society because we don't value the life of the other in that moment. Okay? It's simple, it's acceptable, it's what you do. It's because somehow I still think there's a huge hangover of the legacy of kind of racial hierarchy that enables, Arabs, Africans, and whatever else is constructed, whether a Muslim or a Christian, a Serb or a Croat, enables ourselves somehow to justify the most violent and debasing acts. And the whole idea, cultural erasure kind of goes on across many fields. I mean, it's interesting if we keep it within the kind of prism of photography and exhibitions of Africa. I mean, there's a kind of mayhem really around the year 2000 where Africa begins to explode, especially African photography explodes onto the kind of scene. 1993, Andre Magnan and co. go into Bamako and extract Seydou Keita's photographs. But it's interesting, in the early 90s, these were unknown photographers from Bamako and Mali on display in New York. What was important was not the fact who the photographer was. What was important is the fact that these unknown people were there just to be gazed at. They were just part of an ongoing, if you like, ethnographic kind of condition. It's only later on that the artist becomes important, and then managed, and then marketed, and then sold, and then argued over. Because there was a huge argument between the Pagotti collection, a very powerful African art collector, and Jean-Marc Petras in Paris about who owns the estate after his death. So, the condition of, speaking to this whole idea of visual regimes and colonization and habitats and wiping people out and not kind of offering them a kind of cultural space to survive in is, as this statement clearly says, it's a Western rationality of setting him or her at an unbridgeable distance. It's like, these people become further and further away from us. It's unobtainable to get there anymore. So I think that these photographs can help us kind of talk to this historical space. I'm not locking these in terms of 17 years of photographic production. I'm locking these in as part of a long discourse of how it is that images from different spaces kind of occupy our kind of present. And I think they're catalytic in many ways because of the questions they ask, not the work that they essentially do, but the questions they, in theory, or we could ask about them. And many other instances, Because as these are in circulation, so are these types of images, right? This is Samuel Fosso dressed up as a fantasy African, I suppose, postmodern chief. Ill-advised, I thought, when he was sat in Selfridge's window on Tottenham Court Road performing this image. Ill-advised, I thought. I mean, what do you do?
That was part of Africa 2005.
Correct.
It was part of a big festival. It was all over the BBC and all over London. So it wasn't
Correct.
It sounds like it was a bizarre kind of one-off gesture with no context, but it had a wider context.
I think it's still ill-advised to sit within the window, bearing in mind of what we've just been discussing about where and how. I mean, what it effectively replicated was, Congolese pygmies sat on display in Paris in 1905, where you simply walk by and look at, the context, absolutely. Most people probably thought that this was some bizarre fashion spread.
But part of the context, apart from the history you're telling us, is the context of advertising a public art festival through a shopping mall on Oxford Street. It's a commercial space for advertising art as well.
Yeah, the commercialization of the African subject and where these art objects sit within the public realm are intrinsic. I thought that we could talk about the Africa 2005 thing and the fault lines in that in another kind of scenario. I think that there's a huge question for me when we look at the beginning of these slides, for example, if we go all the way back. Sorry, we can't go all the way back. And what Samuel's imagining he's reappropriating, conversations with Samuel's art, with Samuel Fosso are, I'm playing into that, I'm taking control of that, I'm, confident enough to break it down. I think it's ill-advised. Yeah, I'm not sure whether it works in that space. Yeah. And obviously people like, Rotimi Fani Kayode there are African artists who have been, engaging with this whole idea of what constitutes the African subject. Samuel's work is in a long trajectory with that. But then there is the marketplace, and I think that people like Samuel have been managed by the market, whereas I think someone like Rotimi, who died before the market became as chaotic as it was trying to, break down the whole idea of what constitutes his Africanness. He wanted to talk about himself as an outsider in terms of his sexuality, in terms of him being, a disappointment to his parents, and in terms of his geographical dislocation. They were the three things that drove his work, not necessarily this whole idea of being, quite simply rendered as a kind of African subject. But with Rotimi, one of the reasons why I put Rotimi's slide in here, it's a really important kind of story, is that Rotimi could not get past, in the early days of his practice, what Mapplethorpe had done to the black body. Right? He could not get past that space. Because every time the work appeared in some kind of public arena, or he was presenting it to somebody, Mapplethorpe would come into the prison. Although they're miles apart, of course he understood the work. Everybody who was doing anything understood Maple's work. But people could not see past the very fact that there are very different aesthetic kind of conditions that were informing the work. And there are, many instances where the kind of romance of these distant spaces are played out. I mean, and I think one of the critiques I have with still a lot of the kind of French cultural production around difference, if you like, is that it's essentially still very romantic. It still plays into that kind of big anthropological school where, the essential, noble, savage idea plays out above and beyond, let's just say a kind of more Afropolitan aspect of what could be discussed when looking at these images. And I think Revue Noir as a magazine is a very important piece if we're going to look at these kind of histories and trajectories into how we see difference, because it highlights as well, the point I really wanted to make is that, all these spaces, all these kind of imperial, colonial agendas aren't necessarily the same. They're played out very differently here, play out very differently in France, play out very differently in Belgium, play out very differently in Germany, play out very differently in the States or various parts of the world, and they're played out very differently in Brazil. The agendas aren't the same. There are various different forms of how it is that the black subject is framed in those spaces. But what links them is this kind of sense that there, is that there is a spectacle to be had when looking at the black subject in that space, rather than, if you like, a degree of kind of cultural parity. What I like about Bob Gassani's photograph is that here we have, these women, they're out on the town, they're dressed up for the night, they carry the marks of their kind of tribal identification, but there's somehow a sense that they're not just simply about, being this object of gaze. They're like participating in the space. There's a certain sense of authority and power over these guys in that moment, which I quite enjoy. And it's different when we think of the image of kind of, the way that most African women are presented, especially in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and historically throughout the kind of photographic history, is primarily in this kind of location, kind of body spectacle. And violence, is this whole idea of how we understand what violence means, what kind of struggle means. This whole Biennale is set up on the very premise that, there's a possibility of protest, right? That it's something that is, maybe needs to be reenacted, something I would actually endorse, which is why I think, the ambitions for the festival are really quite poignant and of the moment. Because it does feel as though that somehow, especially within this, I suppose, post-comfortable conditions of where we sit, this recession is biting hard now, people don't quite know where to turn, unemployment is an issue. I think maybe, just maybe, there's a possibility that we might enact or imagine some other form of demonstration, or bring ourselves to a place where we don't have to tolerate the political kind of conditions that are around us. It's like, I'm not talking about kind of micro kind of politics, which we were boiling down to a few years ago. I'm imagining a moment, I'm trying to imagine a moment where people might simply, galvanize themselves into a space where they say, well, okay, you know, we can't deal or live with this kind of idea of democracy anymore. What happens in that space? I think it's a possibility. I don't know. But it is kind of quite common, just to bring us back to, you know, why these slides are here in relation to this. It is, again, it is quite common for, you know, these street people to be brought into the frame, especially when we talk about, you know, geographical places that we don't necessarily understand. I suppose it's because, in many ways, they are the most visible and the least powerful, and you can turn the camera onto them. But, you know, I mean, contextually, I see, you know, the whole idea of a critique around what we're doing has been beginning to emerge in spaces like NKA magazine, you know, like new theoretical understandings about what images do, and history is written from different trajectories. I think the canon over the last, say, 15 years or 10 years specifically, there are new voices. I mean, I think what people like Ukwi and Weezer have just done in New York at ICP with his apartheid show, it's very timely. You know, revisiting that. I think Ulu Agwibi is writing some really kind of interesting stuff about how, you know, visual history and photography and the fine arts are kind of working. So there are these marginal voices beginning to surface, which are beginning to help us, if you like, understand the kind of critical distances that these images kind of come from or are possibly employed within. I think it's just a case of where we look in terms of understanding, you know, what's been into the frame. But one of the things I wanted to do as well, I just want to highlight, you know, Malik Sedi Bey and that whole story, that whole Malian story, and when he wins the prize in Venice, the first African to win, you know, the lifetime achievement. And it's interesting, it's a photographer as well, in that sense. You know, but the story of Malik is a really interesting one, how he becomes transformed, if you like, from a kind of street photographer into an amazing artist. There are certain conditions that are at play for that to happen, but it's an interesting story. One that I think is really quite funny in many instances. So, you know, Autograph is kind of arrives in 1988. It's launched at the Photographers Gallery with, you know, Stewart Hall. I don't know if anybody remembers Linda Bellos. You know, she was always in the press as a radical left-wing lesbian who was running the Republican, the Free State of Lambeth at the time. You know, there was this whole, I think the kind of politics of left and right were much more polarized than they are now. At least there was a left. I'm not sure where it is now. I mean, there's obvious fault lines in the kind of romantic Marxist, but there was a left. You kind of, you know, one of the things about when, we've got a couple of minutes left all of a sudden. I'll do this quickly. One of the things about when Autograph was launched is that there was a certain sense that in the kind of highlight of kind of Thatcher's Britain, that you were taking sides. Okay, you were either on the left or you were on the right. You were, you know, there were all these kind of differences being played out around gender politics, you know, race, feminism, you know, arguments about what kind of even constitutes the term black. You know, but there was a certain sense that, you know, you were on the right side or the left side, or you were on their side, or you were one of them, or you were one of us, you know, and there were, you know, lines that you crossed, you know, and making money was not what this was all about, right? It definitely was not about making money. It was about visibility and representation and having a voice. It was about dissemination of ideas, and it was about unpicking, if you like, the long-standing positions that, you know, women, blacks, gays, working class people were in. It was about trying to create the possibilities of reinventing yourself as a human subject.
Can I interrupt you?
Yes, you can.
Because I think that's a very germane point in terms of the exhibition it's on and the connection with what you're saying. Because I was under the impression, I might be wrong, these photographs were taken by the subjects, not by the photographers.
There's a mix.
Right, but it was just because I was at the lecture the other day that, what's his name?
Julian Germain.
Julian Germain gave. And I thought all these people had been given cameras and that they had been in charge of what was photographed. And I saw it as their project. that they'd been given the opportunity to say something.
Well, let's pick up on that point, because I think that's an interesting
just-
point.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's what
No, there's a
connected
collaborative
with
process.
What you were saying,
Yeah.
that actually that's what I most took away,
Mm.
was what was being done about their work, and how were they being able to show their individual journeys via these individual photographs, which came out as a collective. And it's brilliant. I think it's absolutely fantastic. They're wonderful photographs, but who knows who took them?
Well, let's pick up on that, because we're going to stop in about 5 and have some questions. But I suppose what I wanted to just round off very, 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 very quickly with is this whole idea about kind of the idea of a kind of social engagement, I suppose, and this question of, you know, what people like Joe Spence were doing in the 80s, what Autograph was about, you know, and this kind of, there was this independent photography movement in the UK, which was founded on politics, if you like. I mean, it's where people like Martin Parr kind of even come through the prism of this stuff. Paul Graham kind of come through this space. They've all evolved into different kind of like locations. But the bedrock of where they come from was this kind of space which was trying to speak to a fundamental kind of politics around, you know, difference, around class, around, you know, Autograph through the prism primarily, around race. You know, that stories were being kind of like told in very different spaces and in very different communities. I'm not kind of like lamenting back to that space, but all I'm really trying to, what I think is quite particular that's happened within the UK, or what happened in that moment in the UK, which is why I think the kind of explosion of photography through the public sector within the UK and the kind of and the quiet kind of mission what public subsidy did to it was enabled it not to think about the market, but to think about the political imperatives that were underpinning what was being produced. And that's a really important kind of question about how the state funding system supported a kind of very particular idea of what was important and what was being brought into the frame. So, and Julian himself evolves through that space as someone who was able to, if you like, you know, imagine his work as a kind of political activist. So it doesn't surprise me that he, you know, evolves or is connected into this stuff, because I think it's at the core of what he's kind of about. I think there's a kind of difference of where he's evolved as an artist in a space, but it's not unusual for me to see or to discover way back in 2005-06 that he was involved in this kind of space. So maybe it's probably best to leave it there and try and take some questions through. I was going to take you through, because we spoke for too long really, I was going to take you through a little journey through some of the projects we did, which would join the dots as to how it is us as an organization got here, but you can discover most of this on our website anyway, and through the publications that we've done. So maybe let's take some questions.
I'm sorry I interrupted you.
You can interrupt, it's okay. Oh, I mean, yeah, I mean, there are, we'll take that as the first kind of question. No, I mean, I think there is predominantly, the kids were given cameras and they came back and they were processed and they're archived. But also the 3 photographers were very much involved in photographing the kids as well. So the archive is mixed.
But I just thought it was an opportunity for them to speak through their photograph.
Correct, yeah.
Through their personal identity. But I didn't think they had a personal identity in the exhibition. Or I'm not quite sure where they're going to speak and to whom. Because the voice felt to me very much like it was about the project, rather than about the opportunity it gave to the people who had a large portion of the cameras. And I thought they were so explicit about their lives. And I have been to Brazil,
I think this is an ongoing. Yeah, I mean, I think this is an ongoing dialogue. I think what's great about this show is that it's the first kind of airing it's had in this guise, and I think it will evolve. And I think that the thing should, in many ways, kind of like carry on. I mean, I think it will have a life, and I think how it evolves and how it gets rendered is there to be discussed. Whether people are actually sitting through and listening to the various individual stories that are available on screen.
Well, no, I didn't really mean that, but just has it been attributed as something provide a voice.
I think that there's enough within the package that's on display here to feel as though the kids are pretty prominent in that space. I think so. Pardon?
They don't live long anyway.
No. Well, well, that's another story.
I was going to ask what the, once they've taken the photographs and handed over the film, what, how does their relationship continue with the photographers?
I don't really want to speak for Patricia and Julian and stuff, but as I understand it, you know, they're often, photographs are given back to them as a set of prints, and then they then share those prints with themselves or keep them. Some of them are very, you know, very precious with them in terms of their little diaries, and they live with them and they become part of their personal package. You know, I think there's an intimate connection for some of the kids, especially some of the longer surviving ones, who are very proud that the fact that they've been engaged with in this way. And I think they still do use those images as a way of kind of, you know, giving themselves a sense of authority and achievement that they've actually been involved in something like this. And of course they're their personal records now, because some of their friends and colleagues are not there. So they don't just become about the project, they become literally about their lives. So I think it varies from kind of case to case of kind of who's around. But as I understand it, you know, a lot of the photographs are intimate objects that that the young people, not kids anymore, that the young people still kind of hang on to. I mean, let's not forget, it's kind of, you know, it's 17 years. Some of these kids start this project when they're like, you know, 6, 7 years old. They've evolved into kind of mature adults, and of course, many of them are also dead. So these photographs, in many ways, become the legacy of what they've got. And in terms of ownership, the object of the prints are their legacy within the project.
First of all, thanks for a really interesting talk. And it's kind of a double kind of lecture, kind of two-sided, like a diptych, because you're showing historical narratives, which is very significant, and then coming back to the present day and talking about
Trying to, yeah.
the context of the exhibition that's behind you, trying to fit that together. And I've got loads of questions, but one question is I wanted you to ask you about, we're surrounded by so many photographic images now, and sometimes we forget about the status of the photograph, and maybe 2 decades ago there was a big debate, maybe less than that, a big debate about the difference between the photograph as document and then what people like you mentioned, Makefield, the way he used photography. In a very sort of verified, precious way. And then people like Nan Golding, who were artists that were just using photography because it was accessible to them. And I'm not quite sure where I think maybe what Julian's doing is maybe another section which is just the photograph as part of the everyday. Not, this manifestation is in an art gallery, it looks like art, but it's also been a newspaper, it's come out in other ways. And maybe in those other contexts, some of the kind of highly charged, difficult political issues that Jews, from power relations to Jews, we're very aware of, might not seem quite so visible.
Yeah, I mean, I think the public side of, you know, I think the newspaper and the posters and, you know, where its life in Brazil has been very much not in the gallery kind of context. It's been a series of actions, if you like, which is what I think is important about it as well. The idea that the kids were handing out newspapers and engaging people, the idea that you had to drive by these posters. So it was a kind of, you know, I think that's kind of, you know, the local story has been really good for them because they could see the action. So, you know, they have been very visible, you know, radio stations, and they've had quite a lot of media attention around it locally. I think the problem is that, you know, when do you begin to institutionalize the archive of it? And I think this might be the first time that they've actually thought about that. And I think it's given them the opportunity. What's good about this process in terms of the exhibition here at Fabrica is that it's enabled those as kind of producers to seriously think about the legacy of what they've actually built. You know, it's like, what is it? Is it something that you visit? Is it something that you publish? Is it something that you carry on with? It's like, what kind of life does it have? And I think the longer it goes on, I mean, I'm not sure how much photography has been done now, But the relationship with some of the kids is still very, with some of the kids, with some of these people is still very, very real. And I think that chapter, if we look at like 15 years and the longer it becomes apart, you know, I think the very idea that it is an archive that you can dip into becomes quite essential. Where you dip into it and who's dipping into it and why we're dipping into it kind of enable us to have this kind of conversation, I think. Because I think that's what's essential about it. Yeah.
If you house this archive in a museum, then it's not the legacy for the children. They won't have access to it. It makes it goes completely back to the issues that you've been discussing.
Well, I think what the kids would... I think, as Patricia, Julian and Murillo have explained, I think one of the things that the kids would really like is the idea of a book, so that it finally comes together in one place. So for them, I mean, you know, I like publishing more than anything else, but you know, the idea of it being a kind of coffee table book for me is slightly problematic. It's like, well, what kind of publication are we talking about in that moment? So it needs to be something that does something else for me, but for them, you know, a seriously bound book, great paper, nicely printed, they'd probably really feel as though that they've arrived in some kind of, you know, major space for them. So I think that is an aspiration for the project that's still very, very much alive. And I think it probably needs to happen. But what I would like to see myself is that a Brazilian kind of publisher actually brought that out and made sense of it kind of like locally, rather than it arriving or happening, you know.
What kind of impact has it had in Brazil?
The project locally has had quite a lot of impact. I mean, they have had, you know, media, well, you can see through the various kind of channels that they've had out. I mean, you know, it is known. It is known. And because, you know, that's, but I think, you know, one of my questions for them was about closure. What does that mean? How do you actually close something like this? Well, maybe you don't, you know, but you can offer, you can put it into chapters, which I think this is just a chapter. You know, it's like, how do you be... But what I was going to say, it has reanimated their enthusiasm as facilitators of the process to make it have a wider kind of cultural circulation. So as a job, I think that's a job well done in many ways for this space, you know.